share my screen. Okay, cool. Let me know if anyone like can't see the screen or can't hear me or anything like that. Awesome. So this evening I just have a short economics workshop for you guys. The tournament this weekend. So start with a little introduction. So yeah, all that stuff I mentioned about me. I'm studying medicine. There's some of my debate experience. But I think that the kind of cool thing is that I've never actually like been taught economics. Like I didn't do it at school, I didn't do it at uni. But last year I won Capitalism IV, which was a tournament like this one of only economics motions. So I think that economics is absolutely something that you can teach yourself in debating. It seems really scary, but if I can do it, then I'm sure that you guys can all do it too. So this workshop will hopefully give you a lot of the foundation to do that. So it's going to be super interactive. So if you have any questions, you can like ask that at any time, like in the maybe ideally just like say it because I don't know if I can see the chat at the moment, but if not in the chat at the end, that's also fine as well. But I'm also going to ask you guys some questions. So I would love it if you could contribute and you'll get some experience to kind of practice with some actual motions. So, the little introduction about economics debates is they can feel really scary, but I always found them really scary. But really, they're just like any other debate. Like you can always make logical claims and all those sorts of things, but it can be a little bit more technical than other topic areas. So, hopefully, this workshop will kind of cover all those basics so you know all the sort of basic information and also give you some ideas for arguments that you can have. But my overall tips for approaching economics, I think it is something that it does benefit to just do a bit of research about, maybe make a matter file. I personally use The Economist a lot. So they have like an app called Espresso, which is like you get like condensed versions of articles every day, and I get it for free with my university. So I think a lot of other educational institutions have similar sorts of deals, but really any news source will kind of work. But the important thing is that try and read articles about economics, and anytime you don't understand something, just Google it or chat GPT it and just get it explained to you. And over time, you'll kind of, everything will make a lot more sense. And also just doing a lot of economics debates, watching a lot of economics debates, seeing how this information is kind of used in practice is really helpful. But I'll get into some specific content now. So we're going to talk about four things today. So firstly, some stuff about microeconomics, like different types of investments. Then secondly, some things about central banks and what they do. Then thirdly, some stuff about currency. And lastly, a little bit about businesses and regulation. And at the end of all of these sections, I've got like a practice kind of debate topic. So you guys can sort of practice coming up with arguments using the ideas that we talk about. But I'll just start by going over sort of the content. So let's talk about microeconomics first. So here we're just going to talk about economics kind of on an individual level, like the sort of investments that individual people are making. So the first type of investments we're going to talk about are shares. These are the most common type of investments, probably the one that you've already sort of heard about. So shares are basically when, and sorry if some of this stuff is a little bit basic, and if you already know it, I promise the topics will be a bit harder, but I'll just kind of start basic in case anyone, just so everyone's on the same playing field. So basically, shares are where people sell, companies sort of sell part of their company to investors. So those investors can be individuals or businesses. So when you buy a share, you're essentially buying like a small percentage of that company. So you own that part of the company, you get profit when they get profit. So the idea is that you buy a company when it's small, and then when that company grows really big, you still have the same percentage. So you get some of their profits, and then you can sell your shares and get a lot of money. And some other good things with shares is that you can get dividends, so they just give you profits randomly, but also you get voting rights in the company. So because you kind of own it, you get some degree of say over what decisions the company might make. So some people do something called shareholder activism, where they might buy a lot of shares from a company and then try and use those shares to push the company to be more environmental or something like that. But usually the amount of voting power you have is kind of proportional to how many shares you have. But there are some disadvantages of shares. So can anyone think of like a reason why shares might be a bad thing to invest in? Yes, go for it.
Uh, First of all, good evening, ma'am. But first of all, shares can be a little risky as the stock market experiences losses. You may also incur losses, and this may take a toll on your finances if you're not that well off.
Yeah, perfect. So shares can be kind of unstable, so they can go randomly down or up. You can't always predict things properly, especially if the whole sort of market is experiencing an economic downturn. And the other disadvantage of shares is that they're kind of, you don't get many rights if a company goes bankrupt. So if a company goes bankrupt, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, basically like shareholders are the lowest priority. So often if a company goes under, you might just not get anything for all of your shares, which is obviously a pretty bad outcome. So shares are like a pretty good form of investment, but on their own, they're not sort of the best. So another thing to know about shares is that the public can only buy shares once a company goes public. So this means they do something called an initial public offering, which is basically like they just make their shares available to the market. So before that, only like big investors that have will invest in a company, and afterwards, anyone in the general public can buy shares. And once a company is public, it's more regulated in order to like protect people who've bought its shares. Um, Last thing about shares is that there are some people, some types of investors called short sellers, and these investors try to predict which shares are going to profit or which shares are going to lose money. And when this happens, like if they get their predictions right, they basically make money, is all that you kind of need to understand about it. And they can be useful in regulating the market because they can kind of call out shares that are likely to do badly or like overvalued or something like that. Okay, that's enough about shares. Next type of investment is a bond. So a bond is basically when a business or a government takes a loan from someone else. So, and then they pay back that loan over a long period of time, like 5 or 10 years, and you have like a set interest rate as well that you get back. So if you're like a really reputable government or business, you can get a pretty low interest rate. But if you're maybe a less reputable or more risky business, you might have to pay a higher interest rate. And if you pay a higher interest rate, though, that means that the person buying the bond like gets more money out of it because the interest rate's kind of like the profit you get back. So I guess the thing to understand about interest rates is basically that interest is about risk. So if there's a risk, if there's a big risk that someone won't pay back the loan, you getting interest on that loan kind of offsets that risk. But if you think you really trust them to pay it back, then you don't have to charge a big interest rate. So can someone think of an advantage of having a bond as a type of investment compared to shares, maybe? Someone. All right, I will go a bit slower. I can see that in the chat. An advantage of a bond compared to a share is that they are a lot less volatile. So shares change a lot with the market, but bonds you can usually trust a government or a business to pay you back, especially if it's a really big government. So people use this to make quite a stable investment. And also you get higher priority than shares if a company goes bankrupt, which is a good thing. And a last important benefit is that this is a big way that governments get money. So you guys might know that a lot of governments around the world are essentially like in debt all the time. Like most governments don't have extra money. And the reason that they can do that is because they get a lot of bonds from people and they get money from those bonds. And having money means that you can do things like have schools and hospitals and roads and all those important things that governments do. So it's useful for society when lots of people buy bonds as well. But because the interest rate for a bond is set, that means that sometimes you might get like a bad deal out of the bond. So, for example, let's say that you buy a bond when like the interest rate around the world is like 2%, and then you have the same interest rate for the next 10 years of the bond. And then at the end of 10 years, the interest rate around the world has gone up to like 10%. So that means that you're earning way less interest than everyone else is because you got this like long-term bond that lasted for 10 years. But if instead you bought shares, you would get like 10% interest on your shares. So that's why bonds are kind of like, because you're kind of trying to like predict the future. So that means that it can be a bit like sometimes people if you predict it wrong, you might not get as much money as you would from another investment, but it's pretty stable. So overall of a bond, stable investment, but you don't make as much money as you would from shares. So yeah, right now, people are making a lot of money off bonds because they think that interest rates are going to rise in the future. Okay, so last type of investment we're going to talk about is derivatives, and we're going to talk about the global financial crisis. So basically, all you need to know about a derivative is this is when a bank or an investment firm like puts together lots of different investments or lots of different loans, and they turn it into like one thing. Don't need to worry too much about how they do it; they just do it. It involves some other complicated stuff, but we won't worry about that. But the main idea is that if you put all of these risky things together, it means that you can like sell that risk off to someone else. So, for example, a common thing is to do this with like a mortgage. So, when someone takes a loan to buy a house, maybe like one mortgage is a sort of high risk that they might not pay it back. back. But if you have like 100 mortgages, at least like 90% of those will get paid back. So you won't lose too much money if you put them all together. So there's less risk. And you can also, if you're maybe like a smaller bank, you can sell that risk to a bigger bank who has more capacity to like absorb that risk, which is good for you as a small bank. And yeah, so that's the advantage of creating derivatives. But the problem is that there's still, a lot of risk. If you put 100 risky mortgages together, they're still quite risky. So what happened in the global financial crisis, in a nutshell, is that banks made a lot of these super risky mortgages, super risky derivatives that basically kind of collapsed because people couldn't afford to pay the mortgages back. So what that meant is that all of these mortgages went default, all of the securities collapsed, and then all of these really big investment firms that had bought the securities suddenly had no money because the securities were worth nothing because all the mortgages weren't getting paid back. So basically and then that kind of spiraled and that caused the global financial crisis. So derivatives are good in some contexts, but not when they're too risky. Okay, so yeah, and now since the global financial crisis, there's a lot more scrutiny to stop something like that happening again. All right, does anyone have any questions from that first microeconomics section of the talk? If not, I will move on to the next slide, which is the practice debate. So let's go through this debate, and you can put any questions in the chat if you come up with any. So the practice debate that we're going to talk about is that this House believes that post-crisis financial regulation should include limits on derivative exposures for banks operating in regions with high systemic risk. That's a lot of economics words. The definitions are, so a derivative exposure is basically just the risk of a derivative. So derivatives being the thing we just talked about when you bundle together lots of other investments. So, and high systemic risk just means that whole sort of financial sector is a bit vulnerable, a bit risky at the moment. So, what this topic is saying in simple words is just that if you've just had a crisis, this House believes that regulation should make sure that banks make not very risky derivatives. So they try and make their derivatives safer and less risky. So, yes, a question. Or maybe not. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll give you guys maybe like 5 minutes. So just try and have a think about this topic and see if you can come up with one argument for each side. Or if you're stuck, you can just come up with one argument for one side. That's okay as well. But just see what you can come up with, and we'll sort of discuss in 5 minutes what sort of arguments we could talk about for this topic. And yeah, always feel free to put a question in the chat or just let me know. So a derivative, just to remind everyone, is when you combine a lot of different investments together. So for example, you might, so say that you're a bank and you've given like mortgages to like 200 different people. So you've given them a loan to get their house. As a bank, you're making profit off those mortgages eventually, right? Because when people pay you back, they give you a bit of interest as well. So what you do with the derivative is you kind of combine all those mortgages into a big lump and you sell them all to someone else. So what that means, so maybe you sell it to like a bigger bank. So what that means is that the bigger bank will get all of the profit from the mortgages if they get paid back. But if they don't get paid back, then they'll get nothing because people can't afford to pay their mortgages back. So they might lose a lot of money or they might gain a lot of money. So a derivative is when you combine lots of different loans and you sell them to someone else. So it's when you like create a new investment. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a strange concept, you know. So yeah, in the context of this topic, it means that exposure is like risk. So this is saying like there's a limit on how risky a derivative can be. So it's like you have to make your derivative super safe. Awesome.
Can you please re-explain the motion and like what like prop has to do to like support the fact that they should include limits on derivative exposures?
Yeah, absolutely. So, affirmative is basically trying to prove that, like in the context that a financial crisis has happened, that regulators, so like the government, should put a limit on derivative exposures. So that means they should limit how risky derivatives are allowed to be. So, for example, instead of letting banks put together derivatives made entirely of 200 risky mortgages, they might say, well, your derivative has to be made up of like 100 risky mortgages and 100 secure bonds. So they're telling banks to kind of like make sure that their derivatives are like less risky than they would be otherwise. Um, so that's the thing that affirmative is arguing for. So the government should regulate to make derivatives less risky. But if they're less risky, then they'll be also less profitable, is I guess the trade-off that's happening in the debate. Or do we just let banks like trust their own instincts, do what they want, make whatever derivatives they want?
Okay, thank you.
All good. Um, so does anyone have any ideas for arguments they might run on either side? Let's start with proposition, but opposition's fine as well. Anyone got any ideas? Doesn't have to be fully fleshed out yet. It can just be kind of like a vague idea. So any reasons why it could be good to regulate banks in this way? Yeah, go for it.
Post so I so post the financial crisis, I believe that the financial regulatory body, that's SEBI, should impose limits on derivative exposures for bank operating in regions with high systematic risk. The reason why I would uh, go for the topic and propose is because after experiencing a lot of losses during the financial crisis, I think banks have learned the lesson, and they have understood that if they keep operating under high risks, even though they get profit during times of turmoil, they end up getting more losses than the collective cumulative profit that they had earned in the few previous years. So I believe that there should be stricter limits for on derivative exposures for banks operating in regions with high systemic risk.
Yeah, awesome. That was really good. So yeah, a really important part of this topic for affirmative is the fact that it's specifically in the context where a crisis has just happened. So that means banks have, I guess, kind of messed up in the crisis. Like they went too far, they went too risky. So we would do a lot of setup for that on affirmative. And then in our arguments, we would want to explain that because banks have kind of made this mistake, maybe we can't trust them to do the right thing again. But also because when a financial crisis happens, like all the people suffer as well, right? Like everyone has like a recession, which means that people can't afford to do things like pay back their mortgages. So if people can't afford their mortgages, that means these already risky derivatives become even riskier than usual because no one's paying back their loans. So everyone's just kind of losing money left, right, and center. So in that context, we would say it's super important to like force the banks to do like regulations to make sure that doesn't happen. Does anyone have any ideas for the negative of this debate? It's a bit harder, but Anyone got any thoughts? Um, Someone in the chat. Awesome. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, another great idea in the chat. So because the system is super like vulnerable and under stress, you kind of give them some time for the rest, like to prevent any further chain reactions or collapses if another bank goes under. So you give everyone time to recover. And then when you're out of the post-crisis state, then you might allow the banks to make their own decisions again. Yeah, that's also a really good idea. So yeah, lots of good ideas for affirmative. So for negative, I think what you want to argue is, so if you guys remember before, I said that sometimes it's a good thing to kind of get rid of your risk and sell it to someone who's bigger and more stable. So, because a lot of the banks that give people mortgages are kind of just smaller, like local banks, right? So those banks are pretty vulnerable in a crisis to sort of like collapse if they can't, like, if people can't pay their mortgages back, which means that everyone who had money in that bank kind of just loses all their money, which is pretty bad, right? But if that small bank can sell all of those really risky mortgages to like a big global international bank who can afford it more if those mortgages all kind of collapse, then that means that there's less stress on the smaller banks. We could say on opposition, that's actually a really good thing for little banks because now it's big banks who are like taking the risk and they can more afford it if those mortgages fail compared to a little bank. So that would be a sort of argument we could come up with negative. All right. Awesome. Um, yeah, exactly. So exactly like you said in the chat, redistribution of risk is a really good idea, moving it around. And yeah, it's good for regulators to bring back a sense of like normalness, give sort of some trust in banks, allow them to recover on their own. So yeah, awesome job, guys. It's a very difficult topic. So really good work coming with all those arguments. I promise not all the ones today are this hard. Okay, so the next topic that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about central banks. We're going to talk about what is a central bank, what do they like, what is their job? So their main job is sort of controlling inflation at the moment. So how do they do that? So a central bank is basically, it's not like a normal bank. So you can't get a loan from the central bank. You can't deposit money in the central bank. A central bank is basically an institution that controls a country's currency. So they will determine the value of the currency. And they will also set interest rates. So you probably have heard in the news things about the central bank, like cutting interest rates or increasing interest rates. So that's the thing that they do. They set the interest rate, which determines what everyone else is kind of yeah, awesome. The RBI in India determines what like how much everyone else has to pay to like get a loan or how much they get back from how much you get from investing in the bank, all those sorts of things. So often they're like kind of, oh no, oh, I can't go back to it. So often they're like linked to the government, but they're like not necessarily the same. Like they're usually often controlled by a separate body, but not always. So one of the big roles of central banks is inflation. So let's talk about inflation. Inflation basically means that money is worth less. So I've got a nice little photo of money burning because that's what people did in some of the really bad inflationary crises because it was so worthless that they were like, let's burn it for fuel. Anyway, so inflation is where the value of money that kind of rapidly decreases. So for example, I used to be able to buy an ice cream for $2. That's $2 Australian, and now it's $5 Australian, which makes me really sad. So things get more expensive because the money is worth less. And the opposite of inflation is deflation, which sadly for us doesn't happen as often. So why does inflation happen? Can anyone give me any reasons why inflation happens? Specifically, why there's a lot of it in the world right now?
Could I try?
Could you say that again?
Can I try?
Yes, go for it.
So I think one of the major reasons why inflation is more common in the world was the introduction of fiat currency. Basically, when a lot of countries stopped backing their currencies with tangible resources. So when they started printing money without any tangible resources behind it, it made money more of a trust system. It made it more likely that money was going to lose its value over time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of, I guess, the core reason behind it all is basically printing money. So obviously like the government can just, if it wants, it can just make more money and just print more paper. But if it makes a lot of money, then everyone has more money and that money is worth less and that causes inflation. And in the chat as well is another good reason because of a lot of disruptions have sort of happened around the world. And a big one of that is COVID as well. So in COVID, a lot of governments gave a lot of stimuli to people in the economy. So they gave people money to like spend spend in the shops and stuff to try and convince the economy to get going again. But when you give people a lot of free money, then money becomes worth less. So that caused a lot of inflation as well. And when people like get more money from the government, they spend more money. So businesses will charge higher prices, and then therefore money is worth less. Also, unfortunately, with the new president of the US, there will probably be some tariffs around the world, which means it's more expensive to trade, which also means things are more expensive. So unhappy days for inflation. So inflation is not good because it means that people have less money, because usually people's like wages take longer to grow compared to the cost of things. So they kind of fall behind, and then people have less money than they used to have. But also if you have a lot of savings, those savings become worth less. And that's especially bad if you have like physical savings, like if you keep like cash and stuff, because then that cash can become like worth very little in a short amount of time. It's a little bit better if you've got it in like a bank because it can change a bit. But even so, you can have a lot, like if you were saving up money like 50 years ago when money was worth a lot more, and then all of a sudden it's worth a lot less now, that can be really bad when you're trying to retire. So that's inflation. So how do banks control interest rates? So basically, if the central bank makes the interest rate high, then people don't want to borrow money, because that means you have to pay a lot of interest on the money that you borrow. So it'd be super expensive. And conversely, people want to like deposit money in banks because they're getting a lot of interest rates from the banks when they deposit that money. So you get a lot of interest from saving your money, and you don't want to spend interest getting loans. So people spend less money. So if people are not spending money, then prices go down because of supply and demand. If there's less demand, then costs go down. So that means that things get cheaper and inflation is controlled. And then if the opposite happens, so if people aren't buying much, the economy is slowing down, we call this a recession, and the central bank will increase interest rates. Because if they increase interest rates, sorry, that's supposed to say decrease interest rates. Sorry, it's confusing. They will decrease interest rates. So they want to encourage people to take out loans, spend lots of money, and therefore stimulate the economy. So for example, a fun fact, Japan has had an interest rate of 0 for a long time. Not anymore, but they did for a long time, because they've got a very aging population and people don't spend a lot of money. So their economy was like not growing very much. They really wanted people to like get out there and spend money and take loans and do all that stuff. So they had that really low interest rate. So the difficult part of being a central bank, yeah, is that a question? Maybe. Okay. So the difficult part of being a central bank is that you have to get this kind of balance right of knowing when to increase and when to decrease interest rates. And it's pretty unpopular when you increase interest rates, because that means people have to pay more for their mortgages and stuff like that. So a lot of central banks or governments are kind of hesitant to do this, even though it's sometimes important for the economy. So, and just to bring it back, because that was all about central banks. So the role of a regular bank is, so regular banks is where people can store their money, basically. So you put your money in a bank, and you get some interest back from the bank, which is good for you. And then you can also borrow money from the bank, and then you have to pay the bank interest. So the bank makes a profit out of that. The important thing to know about banks is that they don't actually like keep like all the money that you put in a bank. They don't like kind of keep it there and sit on it. They actually give that money out to other people. They give it out in loans or investments or things like that. So the problem with banks is that if everyone tries to take out all of their money all in one go, then the bank like can't afford to do that because they don't have all the money to give them. So this is called a bank run, and it's quite bad if everyone tries to take all their money out, because if everyone takes their money out, the bank can't pay them back, and then people freak out because they're like, the bank can't pay me back. So they take more money out, and then the bank extra can't pay them back, and then everything kind of collapses. So for example, Silicon Valley Bank, this happened to in America like last year. So the solution to this is that some money, oh, hang on. There we go. Some money in a bank is insured by the government, which means that they have like a minimum amount of cash that they can pay people back for, but people still do lose a lot of money when this happens. So it's important that people are confident in their banks and trust their banks, so they don't try to like panic and take all their money out. Okay, awesome. Does anyone have any questions from that section? If you do, let me know in the chat or by unmuting. If not, I've got another example debate. This one's a bit of a weird one. It's a bit funky. So all of that, what I just told you is kind of the philosophy that most Western central banks do, which is that you basically, it's like you think about inflation when you're deciding the interest rate. So you try to have like a target inflation rate, and then you increase or decrease the interest rate based on that. But there's another type of philosophy that central banks have called leaning against the wind. So this is a policy where you target financial stability. So what that means is that if like a particular, say like property is like in a bubble, so property is getting really expensive for kind of no reason during a period of economic growth, then they will set higher interest rates in that period as well. So this is a topic from Worlds, which is why it's a bit difficult, but I think it's an interesting one, is that central banks should do that philosophy. They should lean against the wind. So they should have high interest rates in times of economic growth as well as in times of economic, I guess, stagnation. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to actually, I think for this topic, because it's a little bit more complicated, I'll maybe just talk through it. Does anyone have any ideas, any ideas so far for either side? If not, I'll just talk through this one and I'll give you guys a chance to try the next one, which is a little bit less difficult. But yeah, so basically the sort of idea for this one is that on affirmative, so you're saying actually if you've got a time of where you're having kind of too much economic growth, the economy is growing too much and everything is more valuable than it should be. So for example, houses are way more expensive than they actually should be. Then if you have like high interest rates, you can kind of like discourage people from buying all those houses, and therefore you can kind of decrease that price bubble. And you would want to argue that when you have these asset price bubbles, that's very bad for market stability because it means that those bubbles can kind of rapidly burst and all of a sudden lots of people lose lots of money. So instead, the central bank should try and sort of control those bubbles by always having higher interest rates to try and slow the economy down in that way. But on negative, you would say, well, actually, that just means that you now like always have high interest rates because you're always trying to like slow things down. And that's really bad because then it's really expensive to do things like get a mortgage or like it's expensive to get loans and people need to get loans in their everyday life. So it's really politically unpopular. And also it's kind of just, yeah, it kind of sucks for the general population. So yeah, that's an example of the types of economics debates you might see at the World Championships. That's definitely on the harder end. But yeah, it's an interesting one to think about the roles of central banks and different reasons for why and how they work. So the next section we're going to talk about is currency. So this section is basically about like, what is the point of having different currencies? Why does each country have its own currency? So the first thing to talk about is just like how do countries trade with each other basically. So countries can import things, which means you buy them from another country, or they can export, which means you sell things to another country. So for example, like in Australia, we export a lot of like animals and coal and metal and stuff, and we import a lot of manufactured goods. So we buy a lot of like clothes and complicated things like that from other countries. So if a country wants to buy something from you, then they need to buy your currency first. So say like America wants to buy some like coal from Australia. America has to like buy Australian dollars and then use those Australian dollars to buy the Australian coal, which doesn't sound like it's an important detail, but it does matter a little bit because when you buy another currency, then you have to pay like a little fee to do that. So that makes it a little bit more expensive to trade. But also it means if your currency is like super unstable, it means if your currency is super unstable, then it's kind of a bit like difficult to trade with you because maybe America like buys a lot of Australian dollars and then all of a sudden those Australian dollars aren't worth very much. And then, America's kind of lost out on that deal. So it's hard to trade when your currency is unstable. But the thing is that if you want to export a lot of things, you want your currency to be like cheap for other countries to buy. But if you want to import a lot of things, you want your currency to be strong. So it's like cheap for you to buy other people's currencies. Yeah, so that's just something to keep in mind in terms of currency. So different countries, what this is basically showing is that different countries want different things for their currency based on their economy. So some countries like say like Singapore, because Singapore does a lot of importing and does a lot of like has a big service economy and stuff like that. So they want their currency to be really strong, but other countries in the region maybe want currencies to be weaker because they're doing more exporting. Yeah, a really good point in the chat about why currencies give you more autonomy. We'll talk about that on the next slide because on this slide I'm sounding kind of anti-currency, but I think there is a big importance of having autonomy with this. But yeah, and the other thing is that in the current world, it's getting more expensive to trade because there's more tariffs with more like leaders like Donald Trump, but also there's the costs of converting currencies and all those sorts of things. So, how can countries like stabilize their currency? There's a few things they can do. So, one thing that you can do is you can make a really big shared currency like the euro. So, all of Europe has the same currency. They don't have their own currencies. And because this currency is really big, it's really stable. Or you can do something called pegging your currency to a stable currency. So, usually this is the US dollar, but in the future, it might also be the yuan, like the Chinese currency. So, basically, it just means that you kind of set your currency at like, so say Panama, one like Panama dollar is the same as one US dollar, and that's like constant. So it's kind of the same thing as having like a shared currency. So what do we think would be some, so yeah, I guess the advantages of having a shared currency like the euro is that it's more stable. And it's also really cheap to trade with each other because you don't have to like convert currencies and do all that stuff. You just give your like England gives their euros to Bulgaria and Bulgaria gives them back and everyone's happy. But also it means that if you have sort of big stable countries, they can stabilize smaller countries. So for example, in Europe, Greece had like a financial crisis like a decade or so ago, and they kind of got bailed out by the rest of Europe because if Greece went under, then all of the euro would sort of lose value. So Europe had to help out Greece, which is a smaller country, which is a good thing. But some disadvantages, like we said in the chat, is that it means that that countries, um, did my screen stop sharing there? Hang on. Okay, give me 1 second. Screen sharing is paused. Okay, how do I bring it back? I'm just gonna quickly stop sharing and reshare. Um, okay. Yes, there we go. We're back. Awesome. Okay, so shared currencies, euros, etc. But the disadvantage, like we were saying in the chat, is that you lose a lot of sort of like sovereignty over your currency. And like I was saying on the slide before, sometimes different countries have different like things that they care about. Things that they care about. So different countries might want their currency to be strong or weak or whatever, or they might just have different economic conditions. They might want to do different things with their interest rates or something like that. So when you have a shared currency, you can't do that because you have to do what everyone else wants. So yeah, absolutely, hegemony would also be an impact because you kind of have to go along with what everyone else in Europe wants. You can't do your own thing. And also it means that if you're a big country, I guess you could also see that as a disadvantage because then you have to kind of bail out little countries and stuff like that. But yeah, so different countries might, so say like if maybe one country in Europe goes into recession, they might want to change their interest rate, but you can't change the interest rate of the euro because then that would affect every other country. So that can also be a big disadvantage. So a good question in the chat, what were some reasons that the US doesn't want a new global BRICS currency to replace the US dollar? So that's a super good question. So the reason why the US is kind of benefiting a lot. So in the current global order, the US dollar is kind of like it's the thing that everyone does trading in. So everyone kind of buys US dollars to trade. It's like every country stores US dollars in their like central bank as their like foreign currency reserves to do trading and stuff like that. So the US has a lot of power in the status quo, but BRICS wants to change that and wants like other currencies like the yuan to replace the US dollar. So the reason that the US wants to maintain their power is because it's super cheap for them to like do trading at the moment because everyone wants to do trade in the US dollar. So that means they don't have to like buy other people's currency, which is a really good thing. But also, and I guess, yeah, Trump also obviously, I think Trump has his own political reasons. I think even if it was an economically good idea, he would oppose it just because he wants America to be the center of everything. But I think economically also, yeah, the US kind of, it gets cheaper trade when everyone else uses the US dollar, which is a good thing. But also it means they can get really cheap like bonds. They can get really cheap like debt because the world isn't worried about the US dollar like losing value, if that makes sense. So you might be less willing to loan a lot of money to a country if that country's currency is going to fluctuate and then the money's going to kind of become worthless, but you're very happy to loan to the US because they're very stable and their currency is very good. So yeah, the US has a big interest in the US dollar remaining stable, but that might not necessarily be good for the world because maybe if there was another really big like currency, then there would be more competition and then that would be good. Yeah, so I'd say the main reason is they don't have to buy other currencies, but the other reason is it's really cheap for them to get loans because they're very trustworthy when the rest of the world relies on the US dollar. And then I think the third reason would just be like a geopolitical reason, which is the most important for Trump, which is that the US wants to like project strength and project control. So it's important for their like global image that everyone buys the US dollar, and the US dollar is really stable. So I'd say two economic reasons, one political reason why the US benefits. All right, awesome. So that's all the stuff about currency. And then we have a little bit about, I guess in the theme of currency, so what actually happens when a country goes bankrupt? So can anyone give me some reasons why a country might go bankrupt, or any like examples of countries you know that have either gone bankrupt or gotten close to coming bankrupt in recent years? What sort of things can go wrong in a country's economy? Yep, that's a good example. Yep, there's heaps of countries around the world that have a lot of debt. But I think a big example yeah, exactly. So a big thing is that they take out a lot of loans that they can't pay back. And also, often they have really big issues with inflation going on. So they often print a lot of currency, and then they have problems with, and yeah, Greece is another big one, like we were talking about. Yeah, someone has raised their hand. Go for it.
And or maybe the countries provide unnecessary benefits and privileges for people who, use that to malpractice, for the malpractice, and they don't utilize it in the right way, and then they use it to their own convenience, and they build a monopoly in that country, and then then the country goes bankrupt because the wealth is divided only in a particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another really good one. And even when they give it to people who use the money well, sometimes countries just give out too much money. So a big example of that is Argentina. So yeah, so basically Argentina was giving out a lot of like subsidies to all of its different
2001.
state governments. Yeah, so which is obviously like, it's a difficult balance as a government, because you want to give people money, you want to like provide services, but when you are giving people too much money, you can't afford that, which means that you take out a lot of bonds, a lot of loans, a lot of investments, but you can't actually afford to pay them back. And the reason why it kind of spirals is because if like investors don't trust that you're going to pay them back, then they make you pay really high interest rates on your loans, which means that you can afford to pay them back even less because the interest rates are so high. So you just kind of get stuck in this like spiral, which is obviously pretty unfortunate as a country. So yeah, most countries at the moment are in debt, but only a few countries have kind of got stuck in this spiral where they went bankrupt. So yeah, Argentina is an example. They did lots of printing money. They did lots of subsidies. It wasn't so good. They didn't quite get there. They're changing course now, but it was a bit of a close call. And what happens when a country is really struggling is international institutions like the IMF can sort of give them some bailouts and some money. So IMF is the International Monetary Fund. So they'll basically give you like kind of a loan, but often these loans are attached to really strict conditions. So for example, they might force you to like restructure your economy, like it's called austerity is one word for it. So have really high interest rates, disincentivize people from buying, all those sorts of things. But these are often very politically unpopular among people in the country, because it means that like people kind of suffer from this because it gets more expensive to do stuff like get loans. But it can be good for the economy of the country in the long run. But it's a pretty difficult balance, because it kind of is also taking away from the like autonomy and sovereignty of that country to tell them how to run their economy. But another alternative that is emerging more in recent years are countries are kind of shifting away from the IMF and towards other countries like China, who do programs like the Belt and Road initiatives. They might give you, instead of, so if you can't afford to pay your debt back, they might give you like instead, they'll ask for access to some of your resources. So they might like ask for a port or access to a particular type of mining or something like that in order to, I guess, compensate them for the loan. So that way they're getting some benefit and you don't have to pay back your loan. So there are lots of interesting ideas about whether this is a good way of doing it or not, which leads us to our next topic, which is about doing debt for equity swaps. So there's like the long kind of info slide that was actually in the debate. But all that you need to know is basically this is saying when a country can't, so sovereign debt is like debt for a government. So when a government can't afford to pay back its debt, this topic says that we should allow that government to like give up some of their natural resources. So for example, like a particular industry or a particular like mine or an infrastructure like a port, something like that. So they should be allowed to give up that resources in order to have their debt be kind of like waived or forgotten, as opposed to a haircut is called, which is where you just kind of be like, okay, sure, you don't have like you take away a little bit of the debt. So let's say that a country owes like, let's say Argentina owes $1 million in debt to the US. A debt for equity swap would be the US says like, okay, we'll ignore your debt if you give us access to all of your coal mines and all of their profit. Versus a haircut would be like the US is like, okay, we'll ignore like $200,000 of your debt. So now you only have to pay $800,000 of debt. So you're just kind of cutting away some of that debt. I hope that makes sense. That's also, you can also read it in the info slide, just with some more complicated words. So I'll give you guys kind of a few minutes to think about this one, and then we'll go through some arguments for each side. Let me know if you are confused by the topic or have any questions, as usual. Yeah, awesome argument from opposition in the chat. So a really big reason why this might be bad is that if you're losing access to your like resources, that's a lot of long-term income that you're going to lose. And it's probably pretty difficult to like estimate that in the right now. Like it's kind of hard to be like, I think that the mines of Argentina are going to make exactly $1 million in the future. Like who knows, they could make heaps of money. So by giving that up forever, you're losing like really important resources. And if we think about the context of this debate, realistically, this is going to be happening in a lot of developing countries, right? Because they're the ones that are the most likely to go bankrupt and have really big loans. So if those countries are already kind of struggling economically and now they're losing access to really important like infrastructure or mines, then that's really, that's going to be really bad for them in the long term. But yeah, a really good argument for affirmative as well. It means that countries can avoid getting kind of like stuck in debt for the future. So even if you have to give up some of your long-term profit, it's like if right now in the present you can't pay off your debt, like even though a haircut takes away a little bit of the debt, it's like a haircut. There's still a lot of hair left. There's still a lot of debt left. So you're still stuck in debt and you're still in that cycle of it's really expensive for you to borrow any more money because you're in debt and so you can't pay back your debt. And that's really bad. So so it's like you're stuck in this debt trap and it's like you should just do anything possible to get out of the debt trap, even if that means giving up some of your resources, which is pretty bad. So yeah, lots of really good ideas for that topic. I think this is a super interesting one. I'd encourage you guys to sort of do some more brainstorming of this on your own time. And yeah, and also for these topics, so these are all from like actual debate tournaments. So you can probably find some recordings as well. So the second one was from Worlds in Vietnam, so you can look for that one. And this one and the first one are both from Capitalism IV. So I'm not sure if they recorded any rounds, but you can definitely have a look for it on YouTube. So a question, is there any way a country could successfully get out of debt? So yeah, it's quite difficult, but countries can do it. So Argentina is actually, I guess, a good example of this. So what happened is their new president, Javier Milei, has basically gone, he's a bit of a kind of crazy alt-right person, but he did have a lot of pretty sensible economic reform. So he basically cut all the subsidies, cut all this unnecessary government spending, and like really like focused hard on reducing as much government spending as possible. And he like devalued the peso, which is their currency. So he made it intentionally less valuable. So it was more kind of realistic. And all of that has kind of really cut down the inflation in Argentina, which has stopped their spiral. This is Argentina I'm talking about at the moment. So that was a pretty good example of a country kind of getting out of debt. And the other way that countries do it is by getting these bailouts from the IMF. And I guess being able to successfully implement the conditions that the IMF puts in place to restructure their economy, cut down spending, and kind of gain money again. So a few countries have also sort of successfully done that, but it is difficult and it depends on each country. It depends on what else is going on in the country, if there's any other natural disasters or things like that. But yes, so some more arguments we've got. We can focus on long-term planning is a really good thing on affirmative. They don't have as much debt to worry about. an opposition argument that losing a source of profit can trap it into needing another debt. So absolutely, yeah, you're kind of like, the more that you do this, you're like whittling down all of your country's resources. So maybe like the first time you do it, it's okay. But if you do it like 3 times and now you don't have any port cities left, that would be really quite bad as a country. But yeah, exactly. Having like a long-term focus and developing different industries like semiconductor industries, growing tech industries is also a really important thing for other countries. All right, so we'll move on now to the last section. This one's not too long, so we should be able to cover it in the last 10 minutes. So now we're just going to talk about businesses. We're going to talk about the difference between like the private and the public sector and what the role of the government is. So this is just some kind of general economic theory stuff. So basically, if we had pure capitalism in the world, pure capitalism argues that you have lots of competition between different actors. And when you have this competition, the best and the cheapest products will win. People will buy the best and the cheapest products, and therefore the market kind of regulates itself. It's always in competition. People always can choose to buy the best version of a product. Everyone's happy, yay. But unfortunately, in real life, perfect capitalism doesn't happen for a few reasons. So, for example, sometimes companies can form a monopoly. So, a monopoly might be a really efficient way of producing something, but if you're not in competition with anyone else, you can charge as much as you want. So, there are heaps of examples of monopolies in the world, unfortunately. But yes, a question or a comment, go for it.
In Pakistan, this is in the automotive industry in Pakistan, a monopoly is formed between Honda, Toyota Atlas, and Park Suzuki. So over there, they actually provide cars which have lesser features than the similarly produced cars in global markets, but they charge more than an equivalent car that's in other markets. So they have, since there is no other option, and Kia tried and they had to exit the market. So that's
Yeah, awesome. That's a really good example. Yeah. And it's a really good point that so we obviously talk about monopolies a lot, but in reality, it's often actually oligopolies. So it's a few really powerful companies that kind of work together. So instead of competing with each other, they kind of work together to make everyone pay more and have everyone and have worse quality goods, which is obviously like a really a profitable thing to do as a company instead of trying to compete. And an example from where I'm from in Australia is our two big supermarket chains, Coles and Woolworths, basically did this. They worked together to make groceries really expensive for everyone, which is obviously quite bad because then food was expensive. So yeah, so a lot of big companies control the market, so that's a problem. Also, people don't have perfect information. So companies can kind of like hide things about their products. They can pretend they work better than they actually do. So people might be buying a product that's not actually the best version. Also, businesses are generally dodgy. They do things that are bad for the environment. They do things that are bad for like people. So all of that's pretty bad. And also, like some industries might just be not super profitable, but they're really important that people have access to them. So, for example, industries like health and education are like, it's really important that people are able to access those services because those are sort of basic human rights. So it's sometimes not a great idea to leave that to the market who might charge people lots of money, or maybe they just won't do it at all because it's really like, for example, you probably wouldn't make a lot of money like being a doctor in a really rural area because people can't afford to pay you that much. But obviously people in rural areas should still have access to healthcare, so you can't rely on the market there. So one solution to all this is, well, the government can just run it all. The government will do things fairly, and the government does do this in a lot of countries with things like health and education. So the advantages of this is that it's really accessible. The government's sort of pretty like accountable, like, people vote them in, they are beholden to the population and stuff like that. But the government is also unfortunately not a perfect actor. So the government is less efficient because it doesn't have any like competition. So it's got no incentive to get better. But also there's a lot of like political issues. There's you can have corruption, you can have things like that. So governments also don't do things perfectly. So the middle ground that we often arrive on is regulation. So this is where a government can basically control the actions of businesses without running them. So it puts like kind of barriers on what businesses are allowed to do to stop them doing the worst of those uncompetitive things, but there's still some level of like free market. So for example, types of regulations that you could do is you could try and stop monopolies. I'll give some more examples of unprofitable services to run. So basically it's like so the idea is like if you're like a say you're providing like healthcare or education or like maybe public transport, something like a bus. Yeah, exactly. So like services to poor people, those are not very profitable because people can't afford to pay you very much for that healthcare. So if you were doing healthcare as a profitable company, you would probably just want to sell like plastic surgeries to really rich people who pay you a lot of money for it. That's how you make the most money. Whereas it's not so profitable to set up your clinic in a rural area because people can't afford to pay you. So that service is not very profitable. Or maybe it's not profitable to have a train that goes out to a rural area because people can't pay that much for it. But it does mean that when that train exists, then people can afford to like get to the city and access more opportunities. So it's like sometimes the market won't ever like fill a certain niche or do it like a service because it's too not profitable. So that's why the government has to do it. Oh yeah, research is another good example. So the market might not want to spend a lot of money researching a new like drug or technology that might not work. So the government can kind of take that risk and fill in that gap. So yeah, those are some examples of that. And yeah, so pure capitalism also doesn't happen because of government intervention, absolutely. So because of, I guess, these regulations, you can't do things like hire kids, exactly, because even if that might be more efficient, that would be, bad for the children. So we don't let that happen. So yeah, that's kind of, yeah, I would say that's probably included in the like businesses doing dodgy things as well. Like we don't want them to do dodgy things. That also stops pure capitalism. So, so good question. How do they stop mergers? So basically they can just say no. So when companies want to like merge, they have to kind of do like an application to whatever the relevant governmental body is. And that government body can just say like, no, if they think it's going to be uncompetitive. Or in some countries, they might have to do like a lawsuit to block the mergers. They can basically sue the companies and say, we think that what you're doing is uncompetitive. And if they win that lawsuit, then the companies are just not allowed to merge. So that's one thing that the government can do. But if they do it too much, that's a bad thing. Because usually if two companies want to merge, it's because they're like going bankrupt. So if you don't let them like merge, then they might just both sort of collapse and disappear, which would also be bad. So it's a line to walk. You don't want to block every merger, but governments can regulate so that companies can't just keep on like merging and merging or buying up lots of their opponents and stuff like that. So governments also make sure that shareholders have rights. So they make sure shareholders are allowed to kind of have a say in what the company does. They make sure the CEO can't just like run wild and do whatever they want and make whatever bad deals they want. They also make sure that consumers have rights. They make sure that, for instance, people have access to information so they can make informed decisions. That's why you get like, labels on food that tells you the amount of sugar and all that. That's all like a government regulation to make sure businesses don't go crazy. So yeah, the advantage of regulation is that it's like this middle point. It's not like you're not fully nationalizing everything, but you're still giving some more governmental oversight. But disadvantages is that regulation doesn't always work because it's very hard to enforce. Businesses have a lot of money. They obviously try to like get around these regulations. Which is very difficult. So that means that a lot of companies just get away with stuff anyway, and the regulations aren't effective. So we have a question. What's the analysis for flipping that it's easy for companies with oligopolies to lobby against policy? Yes, this is a very common sort of clash that comes up of like, well, the companies will just stop the government from doing this because they'll do lots of lobbying. So I guess you just kind of have to do like a bit of a sort of trade-off here. Like, yes, the companies are able to do some level of lobbying, but governments still care to some degree about, they care about voters, they care about other stakeholders. So they're not going to like fully listen to companies doing lots of lobbying. But also you can say it's also kind of expensive for companies to do lobbying. Like they don't just sort of do it for free. Like they kind of have to give the government something, whether that's like money or like a political promise or something like that. So companies won't they don't lobby all the time for everything. I guess they're kind of strategic. They only lobby for things that are like at least a little bit important. So yeah, unfortunately, that's always a trade-off that you have to make a little bit, where there's going to be some sort of pushback from companies. So a lot of motions require some level of political fiat, but there are ways that you can like mitigate that. You can mitigate that company pushback. Like they don't have that much influence over the government. The government has other things they care about, those sorts of things. But yes, unfortunately, that's a sort of annoying clash that happens a bit. So Yeah, another thing to know about regulation is that often people will use this as a counter model in debates, but when you're doing this, this is a fine and good counter model, but always be specific. Like, don't just say, we're going to do regulation, be like, we're going to have stronger laws to stop companies from forming monopolies, or we're going to enforce shareholder rights. Like, say what type of regulation you're going to do and how it's going to work, because judges will like that a lot more. Awesome. So that is all of the content I have for today. So because we're getting up to the hour, I'm going to leave this last topic for you guys to just sort of work through in your own time, come up with some arguments. So the last topic is that this House prefers the citizen welfare standard to the consumer welfare standard. And this was also a topic from this year's Worlds, from Panama Worlds. It was, I think, in round 7, yeah, it was round 7. So you can go onto YouTube and search like Panama World 2025 round 7, and you will find examples of this debate. So I would encourage you guys to all have a go yourself, think about what arguments you'd have on both sides, and then listen to the debate and see how you go. And yeah, all of these, you can find the topic, like the wording of the topic on the tab and all of that as well. Does anyone have any last questions or thoughts or anything like that?
Can you please go back to the slide where you like showed like before this please?
That one?
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll post the debate in the chat. It's Panama WDC round 7. Yep.
I have a
So
doubt.
you should, yep.
So recently, by could there be an instance wherein the government actually favors favors businesses to form a monopoly so that it has a share of profit some in some aspect,
Yeah,
like
so I guess yeah.
like in the early 1970s there used to be something called as a license raj in India. So that's when the government formed a monopoly between Hindustan Motors Premier and um, Hindustan Motors Premier and Standard. So wherein they used to only do they used to only manufacture 3 cars overall. So could how would the government profit from that?
Yeah, so I guess if a government's kind of working with a monopoly, it would sort of, you could definitely get kind of like political benefits of like agreeing to work from them. And also from the perspective of the government, because remember, the government is kind of collecting tax from companies, right? So if you've got one like pretty big successful company who's got, I guess, like an agreement with the government, you'll get a lot more tax from that company because that company is really profitable. Versus if you split up that company into like 50 different small companies, each of those companies is going to be less successful because they're kind of all trying to do the same thing and they're wasting a lot of money competing with each other. So as a government, you get less tax because they're making less profit. So there's definitely an advantage to the government of having kind of more consolidated industries. And another thing to think about with monopolies, another reason why they're not always evil, is sometimes they're actually a bit easier to regulate. And I guess this is also something that you can say when you get that analysis about like oligopolies have a lot of power over the government. You can also say like actually it's easier to hold them accountable because if you're like a regulatory body, it's easier to like I guess prosecute like one big company for doing something wrong instead of trying to have like 50 different lawsuits against 50 small companies who've breached your regulations. Like it's kind of easy to target one big fish and have all of your like attention on them. So sometimes it's actually easier to regulate a monopoly or an oligopoly as compared to lots of smaller companies. But yeah, exactly. So like it's being said in the chat, you also get lots more tax from big companies, which is a good thing. And yeah, it's true that in most countries, mining is a bit of a, Australia included, it's a big monopoly who's in a lot of deals with the government, whether that's for better or for worse. So yeah, lots of good ideas there. I'll go back. Did we get everything we wanted from this slide? I'll go back to the example debate if anyone wants. But yeah, so I'll keep on hanging around here for a few more minutes in case anyone has any other questions. But yeah, good luck for the debate this weekend, everyone. And thanks so much for being active and asking and answering lots of questions. It's lovely to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.